On April 15, 1945, British forces entered Bergen Belsen expecting to take over a Nazi camp. But instead, they found hell on earth. Thousands were dead, more were dying, and the smell of death filled the air. Soldiers stood in shock, surrounded by silence, sickness, and human suffering on a level they had never imagined. What followed was one of the first acts of justice after the Holocaust. Arrests, a historic trial, and executions behind prison walls. Bergen Belsen was located in Lower Saxony in northern Germany. It had originally been built in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp for French and Belgian soldiers. Later, it held Soviet POWs. But in April 1943, the Nazis had changed its purpose. It was handed over to the SS and turned into a full concentration camp. By the time the British arrived, Bergen Belsen had turned into a nightmare. The SS had stopped maintaining even basic control. Guards were still present, but the camp was in total collapse. The Germans had agreed to surrender the camp peacefully to the British in a special arrangement just days earlier, on April 12, 1945, to avoid the spread of typhus to nearby German civilians. The British were told there were some sick prisoners, but when they entered the camp, they saw something far worse. There were about 60,000 people inside. They weren't being guarded anymore in the usual way. Most of them were emaciated, skin and bones. Some couldn't even lift their heads. Many were lying on the ground, too weak to stand. Prisoners were stacked in bunks, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed, with open wounds, sores, and skeletal bodies. Children cried softly or stared in silence. Some survivors were naked, their clothes rotted away weeks earlier. Scattered around the camp were over 10,000 dead bodies. Some were left on top of each other in piles. Others had been lying in the same spot for days, maybe even weeks. The stench of death was so strong that soldiers had to cover their faces. Bodies were in every corner, in front of barracks, in ditches, next to latrines, and even inside sleeping quarters. No one had buried them. People had just died where they fell. Some were still clutching tin cups or old shoes. The ground was full of human waste, mud and trash. There was no proper sewage system anymore. Lice and fleas had spread across the camp, and rats ran openly between huts and corpses. There were no clean toilets, barely any working water taps, and only a few barrels of old soup already rotting. Diseases were everywhere. Typhus was the most deadly, spread by lice. Dysentery made prisoners violently ill. Tuberculosis and other infections spread quickly because of overcrowding and starvation. By the time the British arrived, people were dying at a rate of 500 to 600 per day. Medical help didn't exist. The camp's so-called infirmary was just a wooden hut, with no medicine, no doctors, and patients lying on the floor. British soldiers immediately realized they needed help. This was not just a military operation, it was a humanitarian emergency. On April 16th, they set up a command post at the camp entrance and took full control of all operations. Their first priorities were stopping the spread of disease, giving emergency aid to the survivors, and making sure those responsible for the conditions in the camp didn't get away. Medical teams were brought in from nearby field hospitals. Army doctors and nurses were shocked by what they saw, but immediately started working. They organized makeshift treatment areas in nearby huts and tents. The worst cases were moved to mobile hospitals, while others were treated inside the camp. Every medical worker wore protective gear because of the serious risk of infection. Some soldiers even had to be quarantined after just a few hours in the camp. At the same time, British officers gave direct orders to round up everyone who had worked at Bergen Belsen. This included SS guards, officers, administrators, doctors, cooks, and anyone else associated with the running of the camp. The British had a list of known personnel, but many others tried to blend in with the crowd. They searched every corner of the camp, questioned survivors, and checked documents and uniforms to identify staff members. Some SS guards tried to deny their roles. A few even swapped clothes with prisoners, hoping to disappear into the crowd. Others had fled the camp days earlier, but not all got far. British soldiers found many hiding nearby in civilian clothing. Some were caught trying to sneak out through the forest. Others were found in empty huts or storage areas, trying to lie low. Within 4 days of the liberation, more than 80 SS staff members were identified and arrested. Among those captured were both men and women. Female SS guards had played a major role at Bergen Belsen. They had patrolled the women's sections, overseen punishment, and helped with selections. Some had come from other camps like Auschwitz or Ravensbrück. One of the most notorious women arrested was Irma Gresa, just 21 years old at the time. She had a history of brutal treatment and had gained a reputation for cruelty, even among her own colleagues. She was arrested at the camp, wearing her SS uniform, without any signs of guilt. Another key figure arrested was Josef Kramer, the camp commandant. He had been in charge of Bergen Belsen since December 1944. Before that, he had worked at Auschwitz and earned his nickname, the Beast of Belsen. When the British arrived, he didn't resist. He calmly walked the officers through the camp, showing them the buildings and even the piles of bodies. But his calm attitude only made things worse. He didn't seem shocked or remorseful, and he was taken into custody immediately. The captured staff were separated from the prisoners and held under armed guard. Some were interrogated on the spot. Others were moved to holding areas for more questioning. Survivors were asked to point out guards who had beaten or tortured them. Some were able to do so with great detail, naming names and describing specific acts of cruelty. These witness testimonies became the foundation for the future trial. Meanwhile, British officers forced many of the captured SS guards to begin cleaning up the camp. They were ordered to carry and bury the bodies they had let rot in the open. Under heavy guard, they loaded corpses onto carts, stacked them into trenches, and covered them with lime and dirt. Some were made to do this for days, silently, under the watch of the very people they had once tormented. By April 20th, 1945, Bergen Belsen was under full British control. Dozens of staff were behind bars, the camp was slowly being disinfected, and plans were already being made to move survivors to safer, cleaner locations. But by early May 1945, it became clear to the British that Bergen Belsen could not be saved. The conditions inside were far too dangerous. Despite the efforts of medical teams and military units, the disease was still spreading. Typhus in particular was killing more people every day, even with doctors working around the clock and despite strict quarantines. The infections weren't slowing down. The camp was full of lice, filth, and waste that couldn't be cleaned up fast enough. The British had tried everything. They brought in fresh water tanks. They isolated sick prisoners in separate sections. They sprayed DDT powder to kill insects and disinfected clothing and bedding. But none of it was enough. The wooden barracks had absorbed the filth and disease after years of neglect. Floors were soaked with human waste. Mattresses were full of lice. There was no safe way to rebuild or reuse any part of the original camp. Because of this, British military leaders made a final decision. The camp would be completely destroyed. In May 1945, British forces began burning Bergen Belsen to the ground. Soldiers used flamethrowers and fuel to set fire to the wooden huts, one by one. The process was done in a controlled and organized way to make sure the fire didn't spread beyond the camp area. They burned down every building, including sleeping quarters, storage sheds, medical huts, and watchtowers. Nothing was left standing. This wasn't done out of anger or revenge. It was done for health and safety. By destroying the camp, they could stop the typhus from spreading any further to the nearby German villages or to British soldiers still working in the area. Burning the camp also helped destroy the lice and other insects that carried disease. Before the destruction began, the last remaining survivors had already been moved out. The British had set up temporary hospitals and housing in nearby army barracks and emergency shelters. These new sites had clean beds, real food, and access to proper medicine. Many survivors were still very weak, but now they at least had a fighting chance to recover in safer conditions. The destruction of Bergen Belsen officially ended its existence as a Nazi camp. After the fires were done, all that remained were ashes and charred wooden posts. The open pits where bodies had been buried were sealed. Warning signs were placed around the area to mark it as contaminated. No one was allowed to enter without protective gear for months after. From that point on, the British shifted all their attention to the investigation and legal process. The goal was to hold the SS staff legally responsible for what happened at Bergen Belsen. But to do that, the British needed to build a strong case with real proof, not just witness claims. British military police and war crimes investigators took charge of this process. From May through August 1945, they worked full-time at different locations in Germany, especially near the former camp. Their first task was to interview survivors. Hundreds of prisoners, now recovering in nearby hospitals or shelters, were asked to give statements. At the same time, British units were collecting physical evidence. Before the camp was destroyed, photographers and military film crews had gone through Bergen Belsen to capture everything. They took thousands of photos and hours of footage. They also went through the camp's paperwork, although much of it had been destroyed or lost by the time of liberation. Some records still remained. Investigators found documents listing prisoners' names, transport lists, work rosters, and supply records. They also recovered identification papers, military files, and orders belonging to the SS guards and camp officials. These documents helped connect names to faces and positions to crimes. All of this information was organized and reviewed over the summer of 1945. Legal teams sorted through it to decide who should face trial and what charges would be brought. By August, a clear list of defendants had been created, in which 45 individuals were chosen to face trial. This group included 25 men and 20 women. Many had already been arrested in April during the camp's takeover. Others had been tracked down in the weeks and months that followed. These were not just high-ranking officers. The accused came from all levels of the camp's operation. Among the men were SS officers, camp supervisors, and functionaries who had overseen different parts of the daily system: roll calls, labor assignments, punishment routines, and food distribution. Some had direct responsibility over blocks where hundreds had died from starvation or disease. Others were responsible for maintaining camp security, where prisoners were beaten or shot without warning. The 20 women included female SS guards, known as Aufseherinnen, who had worked in the women's section of the camp. All 45 were charged under international law for war crimes, specifically for their actions at Bergen Belsen. The legal term used was crimes against humanity, which referred to actions like mass murder, torture, forced starvation, and willful neglect of basic human needs. These charges were not based on military conduct or decisions made during battle. They were about how these individuals had treated unarmed prisoners under their control. Importantly, the British made sure that every charge focused only on what each person had done at Bergen Belsen. Even though some of the accused had worked in other camps before, like Auschwitz or Dachau, those crimes were not included in this trial. The British wanted to keep the trial simple, focused, and tied to one clear location and time period. This made it easier to present the evidence, match testimonies, and avoid confusion in court. On September 17, 1945, the Belsen trial officially began in the town of Lüneburg, in northwestern Germany. The trial took place in a modest building that had been quickly converted into a courtroom. It was the first major British-run war crimes trial after the end of World War II. The courtroom was filled with different groups of people. There were British military judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and officers. Reporters from newspapers across Europe and America were also present. Most importantly, there were survivors from Bergen Belsen, some of whom were going to testify. For many, this was their first chance to speak publicly about what they had experienced in the camp. Each of the 45 accused sat in a long row before the judges. They wore simple clothes. Some looked nervous. Others remained expressionless. The court followed British military law, and everything was translated so that both the court and the defendants could understand. The charges were read aloud one by one. Each accused was told exactly what they were being charged with, and given a chance to respond. The prosecution team had spent months preparing. They presented their case with documents, photos, and films taken right after the liberation of the camp. They also brought forward written orders, duty rosters, and guard assignments that showed who was working where and when. More powerful than the documents were the witnesses. Survivors took the stand one after another. They spoke in calm, quiet voices. Some had to pause because of the memories. Many had lost their families in the camp. Others had barely survived themselves. Some of the defendants tried to explain their actions. Others denied everything. A few admitted guilt. Their lawyers argued that they had no choice, or that they had no power to stop the violence. But the court kept going, reviewing each case one by one over the weeks that followed. After more than 2 months of courtroom sessions, the Belsen trial came to an end on November 17, 1945. It was time for the verdicts. The court went through each of the 45 accused individuals one by one and found the majority guilty of war crimes. 11 of the accused were sentenced to death by hanging. This included some of the most well-known figures in the trial, Josef Kramer and Irma Gresa. Others sentenced to death included SS guards who had been seen beating, shooting, or starving prisoners while on duty. In addition to the death sentences, 19 were given prison terms. The sentences ranged from 10 to 15 years, depending on how active each person had been in the camp's crimes. Some had held smaller roles or had not been directly involved in violence, but the court still found them guilty of participating in a system that caused suffering and death. 7 people were found not guilty. In those cases, there was not enough clear evidence to prove their involvement beyond a reasonable doubt. Some had only arrived at the camp shortly before liberation, and others could not be directly tied to the worst abuses. Even though many survivors believed all SS members were guilty, the British court followed strict legal standards. The court also emphasized that simply following orders was not a valid excuse for committing crimes against humanity. Everyone had a choice, and many of the accused had made the choice to take part in cruelty, even when they weren't forced to. Now, the 11 people who had been condemned to death were quickly transferred to Hamelin Prison, located in Lower Saxony, Germany. This prison was already under full military control and was chosen for its strong security. It had already been used for holding high-risk prisoners, including war criminals. Once the condemned were inside Hamelin, they were kept in separate cells, away from other prisoners. Their identities were known, but their movements and routines were kept private. They were watched around the clock by British guards to prevent any attempts at suicide. Food was provided regularly, but there was no contact with the outside world. They were not allowed visitors. The mood in the prison was serious and quiet. Everyone knew what was coming. While the prisoners waited in their cells, British legal and military officials were finalizing the next steps. Each of the 11 cases was reviewed again by a senior military legal team. This final check was part of the British legal process to ensure that all procedures had been followed correctly during the trial. The team confirmed that all 11 executions would move forward as planned. The execution date was officially set for December 13th, 1945. The man chosen to carry out the hangings was Albert Pierrepoint, one of Britain's most experienced executioners. By this point, Pierrepoint had already carried out many executions of Nazi collaborators and war criminals, especially in post-war Europe. He was known for being fast, efficient, and professional. Preparations inside Hamelin started quietly. The gallows were inspected and tested. Ropes were measured and adjusted to match each person's height and weight. This ensured the executions would be carried out properly and quickly, according to British execution standards. Only a small group of trained staff and military officials were involved. There were no public statements made in advance, and the press was not informed of the details. The goal was to avoid any public attention or protest. Everything was done in silence and order. Each of the 11 condemned individuals was informed privately about the date of their execution. They were given the chance to speak with a military chaplain if they requested spiritual support. Some of them reportedly stayed quiet. Others appeared nervous, but resigned to their fate. There were no reports of panic or resistance. On the morning of December 13, 1945, all of them were executed in groups, one after another. There was no media present. The event was closed to the public. The only people allowed inside the execution chamber were British military officers, prison staff, legal observers, and the execution team. Each execution followed a strict procedure. The prisoner was brought from their cell at the scheduled time. They were quietly led to the gallows chamber, where their identity was confirmed. They were then placed over the trap door. A hood was placed over their head, and the noose adjusted. Once everything was in place, Pierre Point gave the signal, and the trap door opened. The process took only a few seconds. The executions were carried out one by one, starting in the early morning and ending around midday. Each time, the area was cleared, reset, and checked before the next prisoner was brought in. Each death was recorded officially, and the bodies were buried afterward in unmarked graves. This was done on purpose. The goal was to prevent any future supporters or sympathizers from treating these graves as places of respect or remembrance. There were no funerals, no last words released to the public, and no official ceremonies. Everything was kept silent and private. Once the burials were completed, the case of Bergen Belsen's guards was officially closed. For the British government and military justice system, this was the end of the process that had started back in April with the camp's liberation. The survivors were moved to safer places. Medical teams continued to help them recover. Investigators stored the trial records, witness statements, and photographic evidence for historical archives. Only a few days after the Bergen Belsen trial ended, another major trial, the Nuremberg trials, opened on November 20th, 1945. These were held in the city of Nuremberg, Germany, and were run by judges from the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. Unlike the Belsen trial, which focused on the camp, Nuremberg targeted the top Nazi leaders, the people who had created, planned, and ordered the Holocaust, invasions, and mass killings. In the years that followed, there were many war crimes tribunals. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union put former SS members and collaborators on trial. Some trials happened quickly, others took decades. Bergen Belsen's story was also taught in schools, written about in books, and used as part of public education to explain the horrors of the Holocaust. Film footage taken by the British was shown around the world as proof of what the Nazis had done. This was important, especially later when some people tried to deny that the Holocaust ever happened. The legacy of the Belsen trial also affected international law. Over time, rules were created that would be used in later conflicts, like in Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia. The world began to understand that war crimes and crimes against humanity would not be ignored, no matter where they happened. Today, the original camp is gone, but the site has been turned into a memorial. Germany decided not to forget what happened there. There's a museum, a cemetery for the victims, and plaques telling the story of the camp. School groups visit regularly. Survivors have returned to speak about their experiences. And historians still study the trial to understand how early justice systems handled crimes of this scale.